well, welcome to this lecture by Professor Bugaric today. Many thanks to ECPS for inviting me to moderate the discussion. I'm glad to see that most of you have their cameras on, and I would like us to keep this approach for the rest of the lecture. So I think that it's a very topical issue, a very important topic that Professor Bugaric is going to discuss tonight, the populism and its relationship with the rule of law. So I'm pleased to introduce Professor Bugaric, who is a professor of law at the University of Sheffield, and he's also an associate fellow of the Sheffield Political Economy Research Institute. Before joining the University of Sheffield, Bojan Bugaric, Professor Bugaric, was a professor of law at the law department of the University of Ljubljana. His research focuses on constitutional law, law and political economy of the European integration, and also law and development. Professor Bugaric, most of us know, is widely published, and his most recent work includes a book entitled Power to the People, Constitutionalism in the Age of Populism, written with Mark Tushnet and published by Oxford University Press quite recently in 2021. His works also include, his recent work also includes an article on populism and constitutionalism, which provides an essay on definitions and their implications, again co-authored with Mark Tushnet, and also a book chapter entitled Populist Constitutionalism Between Democracy and Authoritarianism in an edited volume entitled Anti-Constitutional Populism by Krieger, Charnota, and Sadowski, which is published by Cambridge University Press. So after this very brief introduction, I invite Professor Bugaric to deliver his lecture on populism and the rule of law. So Professor Bugaric, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak at this summer school. I'm very happy to see so many students doing work in populism, interested in the topic. I only regret that we can't do this in person. I'm sure it will be much more fun than doing it online, but no, that's the other story. So I'll just turn. So oops. Let me see if you see the slides. Okay. Yep. So so today I'll talk about the relationship between populism and the rule of law. And also feel free to interrupt me while I speak. And also I encourage students to come with their critique, suggestions, questions, anything that is on your mind during my lecture. And you can use the all the functions on Zoom, or raise your hand, or indicate in your chat function that you have a question. Also, I particularly welcome interventions if anything is unclear and you would like me to either repeat or restate the point that I made during the lecture. And I won't try to do like a typical classical ex cathedra lecture, but I'll try to sort of engage you in the discussion even before the 30 minutes group in smaller works, which will start after the lecture. So the lecture is basically based on my most recent work, but the core arguments are developed in the book, which Vasileos kindly mentioned. So I'll start with first with a question which kind of animated our interest with my co-author in this question, the relationship between populism and constitutionalism, which is just another name for a relationship between populism and the rule of law. If you look at the most important, I call it mainstream literature in the field that has dominated the field in the last 5-6 years, we see basically the following argument being mostly advanced by prominent authors like Jan Werner Müller, Nadia Urbinati, and others, basically saying that populism is as such, as a phenomenon, somehow antithetical to constitutionalism, to rule of law. This argument has been most notably and most strongly advised by Jan Werner Müller. So, for example, he argues in his What is Populism that populism is, again, as such, as a phenomenon, is anti-pluralist, and it contains the elements which eventually developed in a direction which then subverts the rule of law, democracy, constitutionalism. So it ends up in the end by contributing to the democratic backsliding. So that's the challenge. That was the challenge for us. We were not very convinced by this view, by this theory. Why not? Because simply, if you look around the world, this picture hasn't been updated. So there are some leaders who are already gone, some people who were, I don't know, prime ministers or presidents in the last 5-6 years. But you clearly see that there's something not right in this picture. So how to connect all these people, call them all populists, and yet argue that basically they're all the same and that they all contribute to this sort of a negative effect that populism has on the main essential pillars of constitutional democracy. So here we see some very usual known targets, some of them very prominent, Trump and Orban and Kaczynski and Turkish President Erdogan, who are immediately recognized as those who belong to this camp that is usually designated as either, some call them authoritarian or semi-authoritarian, nationalist, right-wing, and other populists. But we also clearly see here some other faces that cannot be easily connected with this camp of leaders. Most of them are already former leaders, like former Greek Prime Minister Tsipras, right here on the picture. Then we have also the former, so we have Iglesias for Podemos, who was also, that the Podemos lefty, the coalition government in Spain, in which it played certain role for some time. And also here we see on the bottom right, actually I don't see it because it's covered by your picture, but it's Bernie Sanders, who was unsuccessful Democratic candidate for elections 2016, but then he lost to a nomination, the primaries, to Hillary Clinton. But he's also known as one of the most known contemporary populist leaders, and I would argue not belonging to this camp of authoritarians. So the first point is that there is a mismatch between the argument of the mainstream theory and the sort of variety of these different populists who have quite a different approach to populism, with very different political, constitutional, and legal consequences. So that was sort of the challenge for us. So how to explain this conceptual overstretch? Because we simply didn't agree with the argument that all these leaders contribute negatively to sort of destruction of the rule of law and democracy and deterioration of democracy in their respective countries. And one of the first works that indicated sort of a shift and attention to this fact of, let's call them varieties of populism, was work by Pippa Norris and Inglehart, but they just mentioned that. So they mentioned that there is authoritarian populism, but there is also sort of liberal/democratic populism. And their example is very similar to my names. They include also some others. Since their work was published 2018, also some of the examples are dated. The people are either no longer running the parties and so on, but they include some good examples of Dutch and other Western European mostly left-wing or liberal populist leaders. This is also from their work. You can clearly see, and I call this sort of positive development, because here we exited this one-dimensional work of populism presented by the first generation of scholars, Miller, Urbinati, and others, and here we have a sort of a multi-dimensional. So we see that populism can come in many different varieties, different flavors, different tastes, but also, most importantly, very different, again, political and legal implications. So we see that we can have both authoritarian leaders on one hand here on the very right, but also that we have progressive liberals, and Podemos was here, and Greek Syriza. We can also mention some other examples. We can have also nativist socialist leaders or free market libertarians. So quite a variety of different choices. So today, because this is a 1-hour lecture, I don't intend to further indulge into this classification, but it is very important to keep it in mind, because it will help us to understand then in the end of the lecture why different populists also differently contribute to this relationship between populism and rule of law. Again, this is also from another work in the it should be the authors are somewhere identified. They're not on this slide. So to make this complicated picture as simple and to understand as possible, the core point here is that we start from a very basic definition of populism, which you met, I'm sure, during this course from many other people, Smude and many others. Includes this like a very sort of minimalist definition where populism is basically about anti-elitism and people-centrism. But from here to here, there are many different ways, so we can actually, the message of this picture is that there is no necessarily evolvement of populism into this part of the chart here. You see here at the bottom, which leads to the authoritarian, even fascist ideas where you don't see pluralism, you don't see minority rights, no division of powers. It exists. So I immediately have to state that. So I agree that certain populist leaders actually end up right here, and they are dangerous for democracy. They are authoritarian populists. But also we have to keep in mind that some of them are democratic. They try to support the bottom-up, participative, direct forms of democracy. Some of them end up here, is more leader party-centric version of democracy. So again, many different varieties, but what is important is that they are being, so the populist ideas are being translated into this practice here by how populists themselves understand the notion of popular sovereignty, which kind of ideologies they adopt, they represent, and so on. In other words, there is nothing endogenous to populism that makes them necessarily ending up on one of these three different versions of populism. It is rather their choice of contingent political ideologies, ideas, and strategies that then differentiates populism in the end of the day and put them in this different classification. So that further contributes to this idea that populism is actually a very sort of open-ended slogan that can be matched with many different ideologies. There is a word of political science which designates populism as one. I think one of the speakers also from the list of the speakers use this notion as a chameleon-like, as an it adapts to the colors of the environment. So that's populism. So it can adopt many different. It can be authoritarian. It can be socialist. It can be participatory, but it can be also very dangerous for human rights. So that's sort of kind of empirical, factual statement, which is not appreciated and emphasized enough by the current literature. So that's kind of the starting point. So we start from a varieties of populism, and then I'll just limit, the lecture to two kind of, I'm not saying that there are only two modalities, because the situation is much more complicated. We have actually more versions of populism, but I'll just mention the two which are the most prominent, which we use most of the time, because either they are very dangerous, they are very popular, or because they're also very interesting. So the first one is authoritarian populism. So the names, I'm sure you recognize this, faces here on the picture: Trump, Marine Le Pen, Orban, and the others. And what is interesting on this picture is that we see a sharp rise in the popularity of votes of people for authoritarian populist leaders, which is not matched by support for the left-wing leaders. See here. So, but that's the separate question that I'll mention it at the end of the lecture, because I'm not political scientist, but I'll give you my best reading of what political science explanation is for this sort of situation, that the right-wing populism is much in vogue, where there is left-wing populism, comes very rarely. You could already saw probably that from my initial picture. So I mentioned Demos, I mentioned Syriza, I mentioned Bernie Sanders. I could mention 2-3 other names also in Western Europe, but it's quite clear that we have, on the other hand, many more examples of a right-wing authoritarian populism across the world. If we look at the numbers, we at the moment, now that Trump is actually out, but still the numbers show that some of the largest democracies in the world, or semi-democracies, are ruled by populists. Brazil, we have Bolsonaro in Brazil. We have Modi in India. So we are not talking about some marginal phenomenon limited to the fringes of a political spectrum, either in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Now, from here, I would like to connect the discussion with the core theme of my lecture today, which is the relationship between populism and the rule of law and constitution, because that's what I was invited to present today. So now that we cleared first the first step, and now understand that we are dealing here with different forms, different modalities of populism, we need to ask the question how these different forms affect democracy in different parts of the world. So as far as the authoritarian version is considered, and here when I say authoritarian, I use the names which are usually used in the literature. So Trump would come to this camp, or would belong to this camp. Orban in Hungary, Kaczynski in Poland, Erdogan in Turkey, Modi in India, Bolsonaro, and many others. Latin America particularly also gives some interesting cases. And what is interesting that the literature often mentions that they use some kind of authoritarian playbook. Some people even call it today Orban's playbook, because Orban is very prominent, not only because he has been now in power for already 12 years, but he has done a lot in Hungary, which dramatically changed the Hungarian constitutional outfit. Hungary used to be one of the best performing transition economies in the first 2 decades, sort of a role model together with Poland, Slovenia, doing well on all indicators, always considered as a relatively stable democracy among the Eastern European transition economies that joined European Union. And now all of a sudden we see that one of the best performers, actually two, Hungary and Poland, are one of the major troublemakers, if I may use this word. So they become semi-authoritarian. And Orban has been very, very skillful in developing this authoritarian playbook, which basically consists of the list of measures that he used, that he implemented in order to change the rule of law, the constitutional outlook of a Hungarian system. And he did that in a way which tilted the field into his own advantage. So that's another important thing to remember, especially lawyers, when they write about populism today, they spoke very often about so-called autocratic legalism. Autocratic legalism doesn't mean anything other than the fact that the populists today very often use rule of law. They use legal tools in order to subvert democracy, which sounds kind of paradoxical, right? Because in the past, if you look back, we were used to see populist authoritarians use it coup d'etat, using military force, using tanks in the street, just turn clock time back, to Pinochet's Chile or some examples, and you will see completely different picture. Now we don't have, Orban doesn't use violence. Kaczynski in Poland doesn't use violence. Well, Erdogan is already a little bit different story, but still, all of them allow elections. So they use law. That's a very important thing. And this use of law, use of autocratic legalism, is a main reason why this is called authoritarian playbook. So it's a sort of a list of certain measures that they learn in order to sort of attack or change democracy so as to make it work to their own advantage. On the other hand, so they keep the veneer of democracy, but underneath that surface, they change the major things, such as the key agencies that are responsible for enforcement of the rule of law in countries, the key rules of the game, and also the key players of the game, like the people who run those agencies, so that they contribute to their own advantage. And that's why all this contributes to tilted playing field. So it's not like, if I use the metaphor from football, so the two teams, the government and opposition, are not playing necessarily the fair play game, because the authoritarian governments have a certain advantage. And by using a few examples, I'll show you how that works in practice, in real world in these countries. So among the first who identified sort of this is another attempt to look at the things that they do in order to subvert democracy. So the difference is just they use different names, different words. So this is basically a specification, a concretization of the authoritarian playbook. It's from Ziblatt Levitsky, their famous book, How Democracies Die. You have pictures right here on the right. And they identify again a set of measures, a set of actions, a set of things that the populists do in order again to subvert democracy. And instead of going through these measures, which are listed on the slide, so you can always look at them, read them, and think about them, I'll just now move into some more practical examples to give you sort of a taste or flavor of this kind of autocratic legalism in practice. So again, to remind you that this is not something that is, and that's our argument in the book with Tashnet, this is not something that is endogenous to populism, but some among the populists end up as authoritarians, masquerading as populists. And I think in the book we suggest it's why it's very important to distinguish between these two different versions of populism. So how then they use this power, political power, in order to subvert democracy? And here I just focus. Our book has several case studies from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, UK, Latin America, and so on. But I'll just use Orban here and Kaczynski as an example for authoritarian populists, and I have a couple of examples also from Turkey to further illustrate the point. Because if I return back to my previous slide, one of the very interesting things about this playbook is that they are very good learners. So that's the argument that was advanced much earlier by William Dobson. So he wrote this book almost a decade ago. And he looked at Putin at that time, he looked at Erdogan, and he realized quite similar things that I mentioned earlier, but mentioned that they learn from each other. So this sort of a playbook, this dictator's handbook, is goes from hands to hands. So so Erdogan learned from Putin many things. Orban learned from both of them, and other people are now learning from Poles and Hungarians and so on. So they're becoming much more skillful, sophisticated populists. So they're not like the previous authoritarian leaders who used the brutal force, jail, imprisonment, and things like that. So I'll skip the basic facts because I see that in the audience I have Hungarians here, and also this picture is dated. So I should, this is not the last elections. But I just, for the purposes of our argument, it suffices to mention that Orban enjoys, this is I think from 2018, enjoys the overwhelming two-thirds majority in the parliament, which allows him to basically change constitution anytime he wants. So he was one of the first to change the rules of the game by amending constitution. There have been several amendments of the Hungarian constitution, and actually when he was not happy with certain result, he would go amend the constitution and gets his proposal done, despite the fact that not everyone was happy with that. In Poland, the situation, however, was more complicated, where PiS, the Law and Justice Party, enjoys a majority in the major house, the Sejm, but not in the Senate. So they have nearly not enough votes to their support. That led them to a different form of autocratic legalism. So instead of changing the constitution, they're basically just changing regular laws. They pass the legislation, and here now we have to see like the first classical step of the populism, because in most of the European and other countries we have something that is called the Constitutional Court. And Constitutional Court is change of maintenance of the constitutional order. So in the normal circumstances, legislation such as passed in Poland would be then examined by the Constitutional Court, and if unconstitutional, it will be reviewed and declared unconstitutional. But that's not happening in Poland and Hungary, in Turkey and Russia, because all these leaders, as their first step, they dismantled. I'll just skip this slide and move to the examples. Packing the court. So that's usually the step number one. So if there are two things that these populists dislike, is the courts, the apex courts, the top courts, and second, the independent enforcement agencies. So Orban, like Erdogan, expanded the number of judges on the court from 11 to 15, and that gave his party supporters control over the court. How strongly? I'll see here. This is one of the few empirical studies being done in Hungary, which shows How often judges of the court, it's dated, it would need an update, but it's the only one so far. So how often the judges of the court agree with the government's agenda. And you see that for the majority of judges, some in 100% of the case, others in 92%. The only candidate, former judge here, Stumpf Istvan, 32%, but that because he was nominated before Orban, and he is no longer a member of the court. This basically shows that the Constitutional Court was completely captured and became merely the rubber stamp for the government. So it no longer plays the role which is expected from the Constitutional Court. Similar thing happened in Poland, similar thing happened in Russia, in Turkey. So this is one of those parts of the authoritarian playbook that I mentioned earlier, that is being used by all these populists. So dismantle, hack the court, limit the court jurisdiction, expand the size of the court, put your own judges on, and then you will have, instead of a check on the government, you will have a sort of an institution that will look like the real court in other countries of the world, but will no longer perform that function. Why is this important for the populists? Because they don't want to be perceived as a simple brute authoritarians. Why? For a variety of reasons. I'm sure you've heard a lot about that, but that's another fact. And they want to be viewed as Democrats. They also often mention that. So after they attack the courts, they usually go for a second step is usually for also regular courts. So again, here I think Orban pioneered the new strategy, which was a special retirement law. So they always adopt legislation which looks on its face sort of politically neutral. So it's engineered to be sort of waterproof to any serious challenge. So basically, he proposed a lowering of the retirement age for all major presidents of the senior judges of the regular courts from 70 to 62. And you can always make, certain argument that might be a good case, but it was very clear, in his case that he was aiming at replacing the presidents of the court, of the regular courts, not of the Constitutional Court. Poland adopted a slightly similar approach, went even further with that, and also successfully captured most of the presidents of the courts, Supreme Court, Administrative Court, other courts, and that was also replicated in other parts of the world. Among the countries that I haven't mentioned here is also my own former country, Slovenia, where also we had the populist government in power for around 2 years, where also the prime ministers tried to follow some of these strategies, but then didn't have simply enough time nor political support in order for that, because he ruled together in a multi-party coalition and did not have enough votes to sort of pass such measures in the Slovenian parliament. I don't have slides for all the examples, so I'll just continue speaking and keeping this slide. But then another important target for the populists when we talk about the rule of law, of course, are after they get control of the courts, that they go after the agencies which are essential for the function of democracy. So they will go after electoral commissions, they would go after independent institutions such as police, prosecutors, attorneys, because they want to make sure that, again, they control the referees. Ziblatt and Levitsky called them referees. So that's what builds the game into something that is being called in the political science literature as a electoral authoritarianism. So basically, there are elections. So if you look from the outside, it looks like they're having elections, but the institutions are so changed, reformed legally that they actually work, better for the government and the opposition. That was, for example, very clear during the last elections in Hungary, when the opposition, formally speaking, was free to put forward their candidates and so on. But in the end of the day, because Orban controlled not only the courts and the electoral commission, but also the media, the main opposition candidate got only 5 minutes on national TV to present his views. Something similar is happening in Poland. If you look at the Polish major national TV, it looks worse than the Polish TV during the communist times. It's basically all about the pro-government propaganda. So capturing the courts, capturing other independent regulatory institutions such as electoral commissions, independent prosecutors, then media, of course, extremely important, and so on, so on. So that's the classical strategical move that these authoritarian populists use in order to subvert the working of democracy. And again, I emphasize, for the outside observers, all these countries look still as some kind of democracy. Think about Hungary. There was even debate before the elections whether the opposition had the chance to win the elections. And many people thought that it had, but it didn't, because, for a variety of reasons. But one of them was also this change of the level playing field done by the authoritarian populists, because, neither the rules nor the referees, worked in a proper way, which is required in democracy, which is to be neutral, to be fair playing neutral referees, taking, with the same respect, both the government and the opposition. So that's the key way how authoritarian populists subvert democracy in this democracy. Some people argue that this is a very novel, that this is a new, but I think if you look long back enough in history, you would see that this is not completely novel. Think about the rise of Nazi party in Germany. It did not start with the use of brutal force. It took Hitler more than a decade to get to power, and there was a lot of this misuse of law before 1993 when Hitler dismantled the German democracy. So I agree that maybe there's a main difference, which is in this overwhelming use of law, and also with the populist sort of a desperate attempt to look democratic. So they want to remain members of democratic members of supporters of democracy. They will never say that they are, authoritarians. Orban was the only one actually who used the word illiberal democracy. He confessed, yes, he said, I would like to be a little bit different. I would like to be illiberal, but still he emphasized Democrat. Okay. So, and I'm happy to talk more about these cases, but I see that it's already 6:15, so I have now to move. Actually, or maybe I'll spend. Are any questions so far? First, I'd like to ask you. Any questions so far? Anything unclear? Anything they would like to ask about the slides that I presented? Raise your hand. Write your comment in the chat function, and I'm more than happy to respond. And also, please feel to interrupt me by raising your hand while I speak. So,
Bojan, if I may,
of course,
may try to make this a little bit more interactive and maybe encourage students, to ask questions. I was wondering whether the term authoritarian populism or autocratic legalism is just a euphemism. It's just a way to express in more polite terms what certain regimes seem to be, totalitarian, autocratic, authoritarian, and we just connect them to populism to show, that actually they began as quasi-democratic, putting popular sovereignty at the heart of their rhetoric, but at the end of the day, their approach has been, completely authoritarian. Is it a useful term?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a useful term, and I think the answer to your point actually would be yes and no. Yes, there are examples that would come to an end to that point, but there are also examples that wouldn't come because it's important to keep in mind that there are big differences between, for example, some people include even Putin into this category, even though I disagree. I think Putin is a good example of authoritarianism, not populism. But there are some serious authors who think that he also is a populist at the same time. But there's a clear difference between Hungary and Poland and Turkey. Even in Turkey, don't forget, the opposition candidate won the elections, the mayoral elections in Istanbul, during when Erdogan was already very firmly, strongly in power. That's not happening in Russia. In Russia, Putin usually gets between 70 to 70% of the votes. No other candidates are being elected. That's not happening in that's not happening in Venezuela, for example. So so it's important to keep this sort of I would say, there's not only varieties of populism, but there's also varieties of authoritarianism, as my co-author argues in one of his articles, Mark Tushnet. So, you know, there's Singapore, which is quite different from Russia, which is quite different from, so for example, I consider that, you know, even between Poland and Hungary, there's important difference. I think that democracy in Hungary is really very close to dying, whereas in Poland it's still very vibrant. It seems that Polish civil society, you know, has more resistance, you know, has more potential to fight back against this authoritarian assault. So I would respond that there is a validity in using this sort of combination of words, but I would agree with you that in certain instances they can end up at a very extreme point and they become simply brutal authoritarians. So in that case, then of course it doesn't make any sense to use any other adjectives. Let's call them simply that, authoritarians. But many are not. So that's why I insist on using it.
Otherwise, yeah, it may contribute to this conceptual overstretch that you mentioned
exactly
at the beginning.
Yeah. Any other questions from the students?
I can't see any more questions.
Maybe when we warm up a little bit, so let me try then to say a little bit about you know, the other camp, democratic populists. Okay. So again, there's a relative paucity of cases of examples. So here I admit that you know, authoritarian populists are more in vogue, are more popular. There must be a reason for that. We can have discussion. But this is very. I know I deliberately didn't want to enter in discussion because this is preeminently political science discussion. I'm not a political scientist, so I'll rather focus again on the impact of this democratic populist on the rule of law. But then, you know, during the discussion, we can entertain this question, and I can offer my own, again, best reading, my own understanding of the political science literature, why I think that, you know, there are so few examples of democratic populism. So again, here we see very few, but the usual targets: Podemos, Iglesias, Syriza, Sanders, Elizabeth Warren also was considered one of them. Some people considered Mélenchon also in this group, and so on and so on. But the key important difference between the democratic populists that they, you know, and then in again in, you know, this is chart from the. I'm skipping some slides because I want to show you how ridiculous were certain characterizations. For example, the Greek populism, which put, for example, Syriza here. This is it's not important who is the author of this chart, but for example, you see that Podemos here was put in example of the authoritarian populists, you know? And I think also Syriza is here behind this picture, which is you know, you don't see it. So my point here is that if you look at the actual impact of policies of Syriza in Greece during the 5 years in power, you wouldn't see any serious empirical evidence to prove that. For example, Jan Werner Müller also in one of the works claimed that Syriza was, you know, had some, you know, serious problems with rule of law and democracy. And we look at that case in our book, and what we found was, you know, that there were certain disagreements, that the prime minister criticized the courts on several occasions, that there was one attempt to propose a new legislation that would significantly reform the distribution of TV licenses, which was defeated then by the administrative court. But apart from that, democracy survived well intact in Greece. So there is no real proof for the argument that Syriza was attempting in a similar way as I described now, you know, to destroy or neuter or change the key rule of law elements in Greece. The same applies to Podemos, and you know, it's difficult to say anything about Bernie Sanders because, you know, he's now a prominent Democrat, but he is not in power. So we can, you know, look back here. So it's important also to be reminded of certain historical examples. And here there's if you read the history of populism, we see that, again, skipping few slides, you see that there's America has a long history of populism. So there was a populist party at the end of the 19th century that was also, and the whole story is best described in this book here by Thomas Frank, The People Know, A Brief History of Anti-Populism. So I really strongly recommend this book because it's basically an antidote to all those books today that argue that populism always, in all instances, necessarily ends in the authoritarian direction. So Thomas Frank showed this rich history of American populist movement which stretches back to the Populist Party at the end of the 19th century, and then goes all the way also to FDR, Delano Roosevelt, Frank Delano Roosevelt, certain elements of the deal, which has very strong democratic connotations. And we have also some authors like Sofia Vergara here at the end. She mostly writes about the Latin American populism. And I think this is a quote from one of her works, where she argues that populism should be considered as a response to already existing deformative liberal democracies, the overgrowth of oligarchic power. And according to her, populism should be considered as a badly needed corrective plebeian intervention against oligarchy. So here we see completely different perspective of populism. Populism is something that can reinforce, revitalize, this oligarchic, badly functioning democracy, and we have examples of that as well. So, and again, one possible objection to this presentation can be that that if you look carefully, most of our examples for the democratic populism come from the left-center political spectrum, and the most examples from the authoritarian version come from the right-wing spectrum. But that's not the case, simply because I didn't have time to go through all the cases. So I can give you an example of a left-wing populism, Latin America. So Venezuela is a very complicated story, but with Maduro, it clearly ended in the authoritarian direction. So that is not my case. I'm not arguing that only left-wing populists are necessarily democratic. No, that's not the argument. I'm simply arguing that there are two broad camps, with very different implications for rule of law and democracy. And as we saw, the first camp has a very strong intentions to reform, to change the rule of law so as to make it work for their own political advantage, which is actually not the idea of rule of law. The main idea of rule of law is to restrain arbitrary power of the government. But all these reforms that I mentioned earlier are designed precisely to make the function, the role of the rule of law institutions somehow weaker. So, because if you have courts under your control, if you have media under your control, for example, Trump, one of the first targets of Trump was director of FBI. In the American constitutional order, it's very difficult to change director of FBI. There were only one change before Trump did that, but it was based on a very different argumentation, because Trump basically used political argumentation. He said, I don't like this guy, so I'll change it. And that was also, an example of attack on this sort of key enforcement agencies such as FBI, CIA in the US, or police in Europe, or attorneys, or prosecutors, and so on and so on. So I see 5 more minutes before I close. So I'll just move slowly now toward the end. So I'm not saying that there aren't examples among these, democratic populists to also change the rules, but I would say that it's, if they remain sincerely democratic, their aim is not to subvert the rule of law, because, sometimes, we need, change rule of law. So we shouldn't think that rule of law is something immutable that should be there all the time. I'll give you just one example. When Syriza came to power, its main target was the fiscal rules as imposed by European Union law. And if you look back now, at that time, Syriza was absolutely left alone. Nobody supported Syriza when Syriza came with this proposal in Brussels. It was defeated. Today, even IMF and World Bank agreed that rules were bad during the Euro crisis in Greece, in Spain, and Portugal. Did not help to get those countries out of the economic crisis. In Greece and Spain, they still have 30% unemployment rate among young people. There's still increase in poverty rates was enormous during that time. So actually, in terms of the substance of their argument, they were right. The Greek populists were right, but simply they did not have political power to win that battle. So, but they wanted to change a very important rules, which were considered to be one of the most important EU rules at that time. So what I'm saying is that at certain times, certain things must be changed, and so not all changes are necessarily bad for the rule of law, because that's another implication. So when you read the literature, the mainstream literature, you get some kind of this impression that almost any government now that wants to change certain rules is immediately labeled as a populist because of that. It's also, it's incorrect. So we have to look at the program of the leader. We have to look at the nature of the program. We have to look at what precisely they plan to do with certain rule of institutions. If they, want to, make media less independent, if they want to make courts less independent, then we know that they are doing something that's not right, that it's against democracy. But there are certain things that can be changed, for the better for democracy. So, for example, I suspect that in the next couple of years, the independence of central banks would be one of such topic. At the moment, this is a big taboo. So nobody is supposed to touch, the strongly legally entrenched power of the central banks, their legal independence. But there is already discussion in certain countries among the centrists, the central liberal leaders, that we should do something about the function, the mission of central banks. That they should include not only fiscal stability, but also employment rates. And that's, I think, is the right way to go. And but I'm sure that I'm sure that any government that would go now into that direction would be immediately labeled next day as a populist in Financial Times, journals like that. And then what I'm trying to say is that we have to be very careful before we give these labels. We have to examine the nature of the program and then also their interaction and impact on the rule of law. So with that, I would like to close the lecture and probably hope that